Well, Mom, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Michael.
And happy birthday 5 days ago, right? Six days ago. Friday,
Thank you. It's
and it's
Sunday.
Sunday. Um, this one I'm gonna ask some questions of because I think it's kind of interesting, some things that have changed socially in in the time. And one that comes to mind is the story of your bus trip, and I think it was from D.C. down to Florida.
Yes. In the, ready?
Yeah.
In 1956, must have been the end of August, I was taking the bus. Well, I really started in my home in Pennsylvania because I stopped to see my mom and dad. So I was taking the bus from Washington, D.C. to Tallahassee, Florida, to go to graduate school at Florida State. In Washington, D.C., you got on the bus and you could sit anywhere you wanted to. So I had ridden buses before and they weren't air conditioned then. So you tried to sit beside somebody that didn't smell of liquor and looked okay. So there weren't too many seats, but there was a seat by this gentleman. I think he was black, but he greeted me and said, "Have a seat." And we then went from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, Virginia, where we changed at a bus rest stop. When we got off the bus and went into the bus station and then came back, the bus driver told me where to sit. And being still naive about what blacks went through in the South, it never dawned on me. I thought he was telling everyone it was an assigned seat. Well, I soon figured out the blacks were in the back of the bus and the whites were in the front. And he sat me beside this man that had been drinking. And if you're in an unair-conditioned bus and somebody reeks of liquor, it really was not a very pleasant ride till we got to our first bus stop. And when we got off the bus, and this would have been south of Richmond, Virginia somewhere, the white people went into the bus station, and then I noticed, where did all the black people go? Well, they weren't allowed to go into the bus stations. They had to find some other place
To use the restroom.
to use the restroom or even to get food, to buy something to eat. And it was that way from there until I got to Tallahassee, Florida.
And was that trip in a day? I mean,
Uh,
this is pre-interstate highways, so
yes, it probably was more than 24 hours. I don't remember, but it was a long trip. And I know I had dressed foolish me. I didn't realize it would be hot in Florida, and I think I had on sort of heavier clothes, so it wasn't a very comfortable ride most of the way because I was always hot. Then when I got to Tallahassee, I had to find a place to live, and I don't know if I went to the school and they had a place where people would sign up that they would take, students could rent a room. And so I rented a room from this lady, born and raised in Georgia, but did not have a Southern accent at all. And she wasn't very well, but she was real nice, and I had a nice room. And her sister would come over and visit her and bring her food, and she wouldn't eat it, or eat part of it. She said, "Here, Marlene, you have the rest." And so when her sister came over and I was there, we would talk. And I think she appreciated the way I, visited with her sister when I could, like to talk to her and everything. And one day she told me, well, you'll have to come over and visit my house. She might not have said house, but she didn't say mansion. And I said, oh, thank you. And later on, her sister she was not very well, so she couldn't stay in the house anymore. So I had to find another place to live. And one day in the Bureau of Governmental Research, was talking to some of the professors that were in there, and I said, this lady, and I gave her name, told me once to come visit her, and they said, who did you say? And I gave the name, and they were so surprised. She was the widow of a U.S. senator, and it wasn't a house, it was a mansion with the pillars and everything. And they said she never even opened up her house to anybody. So I always later on, I missed a big opportunity not knowing about it. Then the next place I found, I rented a room from a lady who rented the house from a man next door. She didn't own it, she just rented out rooms. And she was nice. I could keep things, a little food in the refrigerator, but I didn't have cooking privileges there. And one day, and I spent it took me longer to do my thesis than I thought, so this was my second year there. And I was supposedly going to graduate the end of January and get my master's. And I never wrote and told my mom and dad that I hadn't finished my thesis yet, because I wasn't expecting them to come down. But in the meantime, it snowed that year in Tallahassee, and it was cold, and I had been to the library and came back and forgotten my key. The landlady wasn't at home, so I knew the guy next door owned the property. So I went over, knocked on his door, and said, did he have a key? Because he knew who I was. And I think he had a keychain with 1,000 keys on it, but none of them fit. So he invited me in to sit in his living room while I waited for my landlady to come home. And he was puttering around in his house. I wasn't paying much attention to it. I had some books with me. I could do some studying. Then he came in and asked me would I like to have supper with him. And it was getting near the end of the month, and I was always looking for food, and I almost said no, and then you can see how you're disappointing somebody. It was just a sandwich and maybe a bowl of chicken noodle soup. Well, then he showed me his wife's china, her silver, her linens, and everything. His wife had died a half year before, I think, of cancer. So when I noticed that my landlady was home, I went back to my place, and I think the next day I said to her that this gentleman had let me sit in his house until she came home, but I made the mistake of telling her that he had shown me his wife's silver china and linens, and she said that was the worst thing I could have done, and she told me I had to leave. I couldn't stay there anymore. And in the meantime, I found a place to live.
So how many days did she give you to get out?
Well, till I could find a place.
Okay, all right.
And so I found another place to live, and not knowing that Mom and Daddy were coming down. I think it was Mom and Daddy and Amaryllis, my cousin. And when they got there, I'd already moved. And I guess I hadn't told her where I was moving to, but she knew the couple next door knew because they moved me. And this couple next door, he was working on a master's, I think. He was a veteran. And earlier in the fall, or maybe even the first year I was there, were looking for a babysitter. They didn't go out very much because they had unlimited money, and it was around mealtime. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you put an extra, if you let me eat with them, you won't have to pay me. If you can just, that would be my meal. So I got to know them real well, and I did that quite often for them if they wanted to go out, because that way I got a meal too, and I would babysit the children. And so she did tell them that they knew where I moved to because they moved me. And so that's how my mom and dad and my cousin found out where I had moved to. And what I found out later, or maybe even while I lived there at this other lady's house, her husband had owned a Cadillac dealership and lost it during the Depression. So, and I think she told me one day that during the 30s and 40s, maybe before the 30s, she had like all these black women, cook, cleaner, somebody did her ironing, somebody that did the washing and all this kind of thing. So she had been used to having things.
And this is who you had rented a room from?
Yes. And so evidently they lost their home too during the Depression because she was renting this house. And I always thought later this man next door must have had money, he owned property. I used to tell my friends later on, she would have been wise if she'd asked him over to dinner quite often. Gave him a meal.
So if you didn't have cooking privileges at this house, how did you eat?
I'd buy peanut butter and bread. I'd go to the cafeteria at the school. Probably wasn't eating too good.
Was that a common arrangement at that time?
I think a lot of people, graduate students, rented rooms.
Without cooking privileges?
Without cooking privileges. Then another thing I remember about that time was during Thanksgiving break, they only kept one cafeteria open, and that was even for the football players. And so when I would go, and I would only go once a day, and so during the Thanksgiving break when I went there, all these guys came in, and they were the football team, and they were all battered up, I guess from when you look at them after they've been playing a couple games, they have cuts, bruises, and normally they ate at another cafeteria, but they only kept one open during the vacation time.
Now, if I remember right, there was a certain well-known individual that was one of those football players.
Yeah, Burt Reynolds?
I believe so, yeah.
And later on, years later, I was listening to a program, and Burt Reynolds said he would play football for the Florida State University at a year, and I probably saw him in the school cafeteria the day I ate, a couple days I ate there during Thanksgiving break.
Now, you've also told a story about getting invited, I believe it was to the historically black college there in Tallahassee, or what was it, a professor? I don't remember the whole... There were
in the department I was in, there were some boys from the Philippines, and they met this Filipino lady that had married a black soldier she met during World War II, and this couple asked these Filipino boys to come over for dinner and to bring some friends. So they asked me and another man that was in the department. And this professor was going to pick me up because I wouldn't have transportation there. And he couldn't pick me up at where I lived, this first place I lived, or she would have kicked me out of the house then. And I couldn't be picked up on Florida State campus because black people weren't allowed on campus, or they would have kicked me out of school. So I always told people later he picked me up on a street corner somewhere that was, but when he brought me home it was night, so I could get out and probably nobody would see. And so it's things like that you pick up that most of us don't know what blacks went through. And this professor, this black professor, had an interesting story. I forgot.
So, well, you were saying about this black professor had an interesting story.
He, I think, was raised in Virginia. I think there were quite a few Quakers around there. And he went to a black school back then. He would have had to because they wouldn't have been integrated then when he was going to school. But his teacher, black teacher, went to some white businessmen and said she had this student that he needed more than she could give him. So I think they paid for him to go to a private school somewhere.
You mean like high school age?
Yeah, maybe, might have been high school or maybe even later grade school, I'm not quite sure. And I think it would have been a boarding school, it would have been out of town somewhere because so he had, good things to say about this town, and especially his teacher and these white businessmen, when she went to them and said, I have this young man that he needs more than we can give him, which I thought was an interesting story too, that there were people that did care about the blacks getting a good education, other than going to the schools that were given the facilities that white schools were given.
Something else I think that's interesting is, in terms of change, this is not race related, is, 1964 you get married, right?
Yes.
And late 1965, you're working at Indian Hills Junior High, correct?
Yes.
Here in Shawnee Mission School District in suburban Kansas City.
Yes.
And
I was teaching there before I got married.
okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, no. The fact that when you got pregnant with me,
I
and-
had to resign because pregnant women, you couldn't just take a leave of absence. You had to resign.
right. So in 1965, you're married,
Yeah.
and I assume
December of '64.
December of '64 is when you got married.
Yeah.
But then when you got pregnant with me in '65,
Yes.
as soon as you started showing, so I assume you hid the pregnancy for a while.
I think I knew I had to do that, so I resigned. Maybe I just did it on my own.
Well, anyway, the point being is that you had to resign your position,
Yes.
quit. And so then you started back in Shawnee Mission when in 1967 or 68?
I think you were born in
66.
I think I started that fall,
So you had to reapply.
had to reapply.
Yeah.
But then they were still needing teachers. And then I went to Knoll Hills for 1 year. And the principal there was much different than the principal at Indian Hills. He didn't like women, and he didn't like women with children. And back then, we didn't have sick leave or time off if your child got sick. So if you got sick, called in sick, when you came back, he would question women about whether they were really sick or they stayed home to take care of a child. And he was really anti-women, I think. And teaching there then was a lady, Joan Bowman, who later became mayor of Lenexa. But when she was pregnant with her first child, she got measles, and her son was born with all kinds of problems. And one day, we weren't satisfied with our babysitter, and I was talking to her, and she said, "I really have a good one." And that's how we found, I think Mrs. Warman was her name. And even though this little boy was quite a number of months older than you, I think you were around him, and this lady took wonderful care of both of you. And
So when in Shawnee Mission, because you retired from Shawnee Mission West then in 1990,
I forget.
93 or 94, somewhere in there, I think around 1994. So when in Shawnee Mission were you able to, because that's the same district as Indian Hills and Knoll Hills,
Yeah.
when were you finally able to use your sick leave for the somebody being ill in your family without having to lie about it?
I'm not sure, but it was probably when the teachers organized. We always had an Shawnee Mission National Education Association, but when we hired an executive director for the group, became large enough, and they started pushing for more things, and then I think, I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
Unless it became a federal thing, I'm not sure about that either.
Right.
But we got a lot more when we organized and had someone represent the teachers at the table that was, that could talk more for certain things. And when I first started teaching in Shawnee Mission, the men teachers got paid a couple $100 extra. I think they were supposed to do extra duties, but I'm not sure what extra duties they were.
So that would have been 62, 63, 64,
Yes,
somewhere in there?
yes.
Okay. Well, you want to call it for today?
Probably, my voice goes.